There is a technique I discovered later in life, almost by accident, that finally freed me from a family relationship that had drained my peace for decades. It is called the Grey Rock Method, and I want to share with you today exactly what it is, how I learned to apply it, and how it finally allowed a toxic family member to lose interest in provoking me altogether. My dear friends, before I begin, I want to be honest about something important. This message is not about cutting off family entirely, and it is not a call for cruelty or coldness toward people you genuinely love. This is specifically about a particular kind of relationship, the kind where someone in your family thrives on your emotional reactions, someone who seems to seek out conflict, criticism, or drama specifically because your response, whether hurt, anger, or anxious explanation, gives them exactly what they are looking for. If you have someone like this in your own family, I believe what I am about to share may genuinely change your life the way it changed mine. The relationship that drained me for decades, I want to tell you honestly about the relationship that led me to discover this method, because I believe many of you may recognize a similar dynamic in your own family. For most of my adult life, I had a difficult relationship with a sibling who seemed to genuinely enjoy provoking emotional reactions from me. Criticism disguised as concern. Comments designed to unsettle rather than inform. A pattern of behavior that, over decades, I slowly began to recognize as something more than ordinary sibling friction. Every family gathering became an occasion for some form of pointed remark, some critical observation about my choices, my parenting decisions from decades earlier, my finances, my appearance, delivered in a tone that always allowed for plausible deniability, always framed in a way that made my hurt or frustrated response seem like an overreaction on my part rather than a reasonable response to genuine provocation. For years, I responded exactly the way this dynamic seemed designed to produce. I explained myself. I defended my choices. I expressed hurt and frustration. I engaged, fully and emotionally, every single time. I want to be honest, this pattern exhausted me for decades. I would leave family gatherings feeling depleted, replaying conversations for days afterward, wondering what I could have said differently, wondering why this particular relationship continued to affect me so deeply despite my best efforts to simply let these comments go. What I did not understand, for far too many years, was that my emotional engagement, however reasonable and understandable, was actually the very thing sustaining this painful dynamic. The realization that changed everything. The turning point came during a conversation with a close friend who had experienced a similar dynamic with a difficult family member of her own. She introduced me to a concept I had never encountered before, a psychological strategy called the Grey Rock Method, originally developed as a way of protecting oneself from individuals who seem to feed on emotional reaction and conflict, individuals sometimes described as having manipulative or narcissistic tendencies. Though I want to be clear that you do not need a formal diagnosis to recognize this pattern in someone close to you. She explained the concept simply. Certain people, for reasons rooted in their own psychology that are not mine to fully understand or diagnose, seem to derive genuine satisfaction from provoking emotional reactions in others, particularly reactions like hurt, anger, defensiveness, or anxious explanation. For these individuals, your emotional response, regardless of whether it is positive or negative, functions almost like fuel, feeding a cycle where they continue seeking out these reactions because the reactions themselves provide something they are unconsciously seeking, whether attention, a sense of power, or simply the drama itself. The Grey Rock Method, she explained, involves deliberately becoming as unremarkable and uninteresting as an ordinary grey rock in your interactions with this particular person. You do not provide the emotional reaction they are seeking. You respond with minimal, neutral, unremarkable engagement, offering nothing for them to work with, nothing to provoke further, nothing interesting enough to sustain their attention. Over time, deprived of the emotional reaction that had always sustained their interest, many people practicing this method find that the difficult individual gradually loses interest in continuing the provocation altogether, because the interaction itself has become genuinely boring to them. My skepticism at first, I want to be honest with you, when I first heard about this method, I was genuinely skeptical. It seemed almost too simple to address a dynamic that had caused me genuine pain for decades. I also felt some initial discomfort with the idea, wondering whether becoming deliberately unremarkable and unengaged with a family member represented some form of dishonesty or emotional withdrawal that felt inconsistent with the genuine, open communication I generally valued in my relationships. But after considerable reflection, I began to understand something important. This particular relationship had never actually been built on genuine, open communication in the first place. The provocations I regularly received were not honest attempts at genuine connection or constructive feedback. They were, upon honest reflection, deliberate or at least habitual attempts to produce a reaction, any reaction, regardless of whether that reaction served any genuine relational purpose. Given this reality, I began to understand that withholding my usual emotional engagement was not a betrayal of genuine communication. It was simply a refusal to continue participating in a pattern that had never actually been genuine communication to begin with. I decided, cautiously at first, to try this method during our next interaction, and what happened surprised me significantly. What the grey rock method actually looks like in practice, I want to walk you through exactly what this method involves in practical terms, because I believe the specific details matter enormously for genuinely understanding how to apply it in your own difficult relationships. The core principle involves offering minimal, neutral, unremarkable responses to provocative comments or questions, rather than the detailed, emotional engagement you might have offered in the past. When my sibling made a pointed comment about a decision from my past, rather than explaining my reasoning in detail or expressing hurt at the implied criticism, I began responding with brief, neutral statements such as, "That's one way to look at it," or simply, "Interesting," before calmly changing the subject or redirecting the conversation towards something entirely unrelated and mundane. The method also involves deliberately limiting the personal information you share with this particular individual. In the past, I had shared details about my life, my feelings, my struggles, and my triumphs freely with my sibling, providing ample material for future provocative comments. I began, deliberately, sharing far less personal information, keeping conversations focused on genuinely surface-level topics, the weather, general news, simple pleasantries, rather than the personal details that had previously provided ammunition for pointed remarks. Perhaps most importantly, the method requires consistently withholding visible emotional reaction, regardless of how provocative a comment might be. This does not mean suppressing your actual internal feelings, which remain entirely valid and important. It means simply not displaying those feelings outwardly in your interactions with this particular person, denying them the visible emotional response that had always sustained their pattern of provocation in the past. The first time I practiced this method, I want to share with you the specific interaction that first demonstrated to me how powerfully this method could work. During a family gathering shortly after learning about this approach, my sibling made a comment, delivered with the familiar tone of concerned criticism, about a financial decision I had made years earlier. In the past, this comment would have triggered a lengthy, defensive explanation on my part, an explanation that would have likely continued throughout much of the gathering, providing exactly the kind of engaged, emotional interaction that had always characterized our relationship. Instead, I simply said, calmly and briefly, "That's an interesting perspective," and I turned my attention to my grandchild sitting nearby, asking about her day at school. I did not elaborate further. I did not defend my decision. I did not express any visible hurt or frustration at the implied criticism. I simply moved on, entirely, to a different topic and a different conversation partner. I want to be honest, this required considerable internal discipline. My old instincts urged me strongly to respond, to defend myself, to explain my reasoning in detail. But I held to my new practice, and I noticed something remarkable. My sibling, having received none of the emotional engagement that had always followed similar comments in the past, seemed genuinely unsure how to proceed. The conversation simply moved on, without the extended, draining exchange that would have characterized this same interaction in previous years. How the pattern changed over time, I want to walk you through how this dynamic evolved over the following months and years, because I believe understanding this gradual process will help you approach your own similar relationships with realistic expectations rather than anticipating instant transformation. In the initial weeks after I began practicing this method consistently, my sibling actually seemed to escalate the provocation somewhat, offering more pointed comments, seemingly testing whether the old emotional reaction might still be elicited through increased intensity. This escalation, I want to be honest, was genuinely difficult to navigate, and I found myself needing considerable resolve to continue offering neutral, minimal responses rather than finally engaging with the heightened provocation. However, after several months of consistent practice, I began to notice a genuine shift. The frequency and intensity of provocative comments began to decrease significantly. Our interactions, while still not warm or genuinely close in the way I might have once hoped for, became noticeably calmer and less frequent in their provocative content. Over the following 2 years, this pattern continued to evolve, and eventually, my sibling began engaging with me far less overall, seeking interaction and attention elsewhere, from family members or acquaintances who perhaps still provided the emotional reaction that our interactions no longer offered. I want to be honest about how this ultimately felt. There was, initially, a strange sense of loss even amid the relief, a recognition that this particular relationship, which had never actually been genuinely close or nourishing despite decades of my emotional investment in it, was becoming increasingly distant. Over time, however, this distance transformed into something genuinely valuable: peace. I no longer dreaded family gatherings the way I once had. I no longer replayed painful conversations for days afterward. The emotional energy I had spent for decades managing this difficult relationship became available, instead, for relationships that genuinely nourished me. Distinguishing this from ordinary family conflict, I want to be very clear about something important. My friends, because I do not want this method to be misapplied to relationships that do not actually warrant this particular approach. The Grey Rock method is specifically designed for relationships characterized by a genuine pattern of provocation, manipulation, or emotional exploitation, not for ordinary family disagreements or occasional friction that exists within virtually every genuine relationship. If a family member offers genuine, well-intentioned feedback, even if delivered imperfectly or in a way that stings somewhat, this generally does not warrant the Grey Rock method. Ordinary family relationships, even difficult ones, generally benefit far more from open, honest communication than from deliberate emotional withdrawal. This method is specifically reserved for relationships where you have observed, over time, a consistent pattern of provocation that seems designed to produce reaction rather than genuine connection or constructive resolution. I encourage you to reflect honestly on your own difficult family relationships before applying this method, considering carefully whether the difficulty you are experiencing reflects genuine, if imperfect, attempts at connection, or whether it reflects a more troubling pattern specifically oriented around producing emotional reaction through provocation, criticism, or manipulation. Addressing the concern that this method seems manipulative or dishonest, I know some of you may wonder whether this method itself involves a form of manipulation or dishonesty, deliberately withholding genuine emotional response in a calculated way. I want to address this concern honestly, because it deserves genuine consideration. I want to distinguish clearly between manipulation, which generally involves deceiving someone or exploiting them for your own benefit at their genuine expense, and the Grey Rock method, which involves simply declining to provide emotional material to someone who has demonstrated a consistent pattern of exploiting that material for their own purposes, often at genuine cost to your own well-being. You are not deceiving this person about anything significant. You are simply declining to continue offering the emotional engagement that has, historically, fueled a genuinely harmful dynamic within the relationship. I would also gently suggest that continuing to offer full emotional engagement to someone who has consistently demonstrated a pattern of using that engagement to cause you genuine pain is not actually more honest or virtuous than protecting yourself through this method. Self-protection, particularly from a consistent pattern of genuine harm, is not dishonesty. It is simply wisdom, earned through painful experience, about how to navigate a relationship that has not served your genuine well-being. When this method may not be sufficient, I want to be honest with you about the limitations of this approach, because I do not want to suggest it is a complete solution for every difficult family relationship. In cases involving genuinely severe emotional abuse, ongoing harassment, or situations that affect your safety or genuine mental health significantly, the Grey Rock method alone may not be sufficient, and I would encourage you, in those more serious circumstances, to consider additional support, whether through a therapist, a counselor, or in severe cases, more significant boundaries such as limited or no contact with the individual in question. This method works best for ongoing, unavoidable family relationships, situations where complete separation is not desired or practical, but where you genuinely need protection from a consistent pattern of provocation. What this method ultimately gave me since practicing this method consistently over the past several years, I want to share honestly what it has given me. I no longer dread the family gatherings that once filled me with quiet anxiety for days in advance. I no longer carry the exhausting emotional weight of a relationship that consistently drained far more than it ever gave. I have discovered a genuine sense of peace in my interactions with this particular family member, a peace built not on resolution or reconciliation in the traditional sense, but on my own genuine protection of my emotional well-being. I have also discovered that the emotional energy I once spent almost entirely on managing this difficult relationship has become available for relationships that genuinely nourish me, relationships with family members and friends who engage with me from genuine care and connection rather than a pattern of provocation. This redirection of my emotional energy, I believe, has been one of the most significant benefits of learning and applying this method. My final words to you, my dear friends, if you have a family member who seems to thrive on your emotional reactions, who consistently provokes hurt, anger, or anxious explanation through criticism or manipulation disguised as concern, I want you to know that you are not obligated to continue providing the emotional engagement that sustains this painful pattern. You can, with practice and genuine resolve, learn to offer minimal, neutral, unremarkable responses that gradually remove the fuel this particular dynamic has always required. This is not about becoming a cold or uncaring person. It is about protecting your own genuine peace from a relationship pattern that was never actually built on genuine care in the first place. You have earned, across decades of life, the right to protect your remaining years from relationships that consistently drain rather than nourish you, and the Grey Rock method may be exactly the tool you need to finally reclaim that peace. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If these words resonated with you, I hope you will consider, carefully and honestly, whether this method might help you navigate a similarly difficult relationship in your own family. Your peace, your emotional energy, and your remaining years all deserve genuine protection from patterns that have caused you unnecessary pain for far too long. This has been Life Mastery 60+. Until next time, protect your peace, offer your energy only where it is genuinely honored, and remember that you are never obligated to keep feeding a fire that only ever burns you.